Several weeks back, my family and I got to do something we haven't got to do in a long time. We got to have Christmas lunch at my mom's house, and I was trying to think about the last time we've got to do that. The last time we got to do that, Seth was 6 months old, so it's been a little while. It's been about 14 years since we all got to get together on Christmas and have lunch together and have all the cousins together. And one striking thing is that all those cousins have changed a little bit in 14 years. They've all grown, they're all different, and they're all very different from one another. I think about my nephew Jordan, and Jordan is an awesome kid. He's a special kid. He suffers with Asperger's, but he is one of the most exciting, funny, hilarious kids you'll ever want to meet. He's 23, I guess, and he is just hilarious. And then there's my niece Casey, and Casey is hilarious, but in a completely different way. She can be hilarious without saying a word. She's one of those that can just have the right look and you crack up laughing. She's about 2 feet tall. No, she's a little taller than that, but she's very short. She's very hilarious. And then there's like Curtis is a little more quiet of my three kids, and then there's Hunter, who is louder than anyone I've ever met in my life. And then there's, they're all different. They're very different children. And it's funny as they've grown how different they have become. But there's one striking comparison. If my parents hadn't met, they wouldn't exist. Matter of fact, if you walk down my parents' hallway, there's a picture of my mom and dad, and then there's all four families under them, and it says, "Because two people fell in love." I love that. And that's the commonality they have, even though they're incredibly different people. In this morning's text, we're going to meet four people who are incredibly different. But even though they're incredibly different people, they had one striking commonality. Aeneas, Tabitha, Simon the tanner, and Cornelius are very different people. And of course, one thing they had in common was that God loved every one of them. But there was another commonality that I want us to notice this morning. But first, let's take a few moments to introduce ourselves to these people, starting with Aeneas in chapter 9, beginning in verse 32. And Peter traveled about the country. He went to visit the saints in Lydia. He found a man named Aeneas, a paralytic who had been bedridden for 8 years. Aeneas, Peter said to him, "Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and take care of your mat." Immediately, Aeneas got up. All those who lived in Lydia and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. When I read the story of Aeneas, I realize that God loves high-maintenance people. He'd been lying here for a long time. There's no mention of his family or friends. He has nothing to contribute to the church. Matter of fact, if he comes to the church, if he comes to God's house, there's a good chance, even though he's healed, that at least for a while, he is going to put a drain on their resources. But God puts people in our path that he wants us to care for. People may not have much to offer the church. And sometimes we look at people who come to the church. I look at people who come to the church somewhat selfishly. Well, what talents do they have? What can they offer? How can they help us grow? But some people come not having anything to offer, but God still expects us to offer them something. And they may not be suffering from paralysis, as it were, but they may be suffering from something. And we need to remember that not all paralysis is physical paralysis. There's mental paralysis. We will have people put in our path that have been paralyzed by fear, People who have been paralyzed by drugs or alcoholism or abuse. And no matter what they have been paralyzed with, it is our responsibility to love them and offer them healing that only Jesus can bring. Peter says to Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals. And I'm here to tell you, Jesus Christ still heals. He heals people who are paralyzed by their fear and by their addictions and by their anger and by their past. Now I'm going to tell you that ministering to high maintenance people isn't always easy. Let me rephrase that. It's never easy. It's not. But a person's worth is not measured by what they can do, but how they are seen in the eyes of God. See, Aeneas had worth in God's eyes. Do you know why Aeneas had worth in God's eyes? Because God made him. Because God created him. Because God loved him and cared about him. There is no such thing as a nobody in the eyes of our God. Our Creator loves us unconditionally. Psychologists say that that we will be what we think the greatest person in our lives thinks we are. I want to repeat that to you. We will be what we think the greatest person in our lives thinks we are. God says, you are worth the life of my beloved Son. Church, there are no outcasts in the eyes of God. There are no worthless people in the eyes of God. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we believe that God can use high-maintenance people to bless and enrich our church? And the answer is yes, He can. Who better to reach an addict than a former addict? Who better to reach a homeless person for Christ than someone who has made Christ their home? Paul told the church at Corinth that God comforts us in our affliction so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves were comforted by God. If we want to reach addicts for Christ, it begins with reaching one. If we want to reach the homeless for Christ, it begins with reaching one. If we want to reach prostitutes for Christ, it begins with reaching one. If we want to reach the spiritually paralyzed for Christ, it begins with reaching one. Now let me introduce you to Tabitha. Beginning in verse 36. In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas, who always was doing good and helping the poor. About the same time that she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upper room. Lydia was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydia, they sent 2 men and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs into the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing the robes and clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with him. Peter sent them out of the room, and he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. When I read this story, I know that God loves the helpless. You see, Tabitha had the spiritual gift of a helper, of a giver. But yet she became sick, and she was dying, and she died, and the people that she cared for were with her. The helper had become helpless. Now, up until this time, no apostle had raised the dead. They'd healed, they had exorcised demons, but they had not resurrected the dead as of yet. So they went and they got Peter. He simply kneeled before the woman and prayed and told her to get up. Even those who have much to offer the kingdom sometimes will reach points in their ministry and in their lives where they're helpless. Some of God's greatest warriors, some of God's greatest servants sometimes get to a point where they're helpless. They're tired. They're weary. Maybe they're even spiritually dead. There are times that all of us become helpless. William Schultz tells the story of one night his 3-year-old little girl was upstairs, and all of a sudden he hears her before bed, and she says, "Dad, I need help. Dad, I need help." And finally, after 2 or 3 "Dad, I need helps," he walked upstairs and he says, "What do you need, sweetie?" She says, I need help getting dressed for bed." And she said, and he replies to her, he says, "You know how to dress yourself." And her reply from the mouth of babes, she said, "Sometimes people need people anyway, even when they know how to do things by themselves." We need each other, don't we? Because there are times that each of us, maybe as strong as we feel and as strong as we've been, we reach helplessness. And sometimes we're not very good at that with each other. We're not. We maybe see someone not being quite as strong as they used to be, and we kind of stand back and go, "What's wrong with them?" Instead of saying, "Curtis, get up! Tom, get up! Glenn, get up!" Because sometimes even the strongest of servants become helpless. And unless someone can come along and encourage us to get up, we may never get up. Let me introduce you to now Simon the tanner. Verse 43, very briefly. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. When I see this short little verse, I realize that God loves ordinary people. God loves the ordinary. Those who don't even know that they have something they can contribute. Simon was a tanner, and I can imagine that a tanner would be maybe not the most revered of trades. Someone who typically did their trade on the outside of town because tanning hides in the sun was a very smelly existence. Tanners were very ordinary people. Those who worked jobs most people would avoid. But yet, without those people, we wouldn't have what we have. God needs ordinary people. You see, God used Simon the tanner to prepare Peter to meet Cornelius. God uses those who don't know what they can contribute to prepare other people for ministry. You see, you don't have to be a preacher or a youth minister or a song leader or an elder or a Bible class teacher to do mighty things for God. You don't have to stand in a pulpit to be powerful. I can't help but think when I make that statement, I can't help but think about my Aunt Armilda who passed away on Thursday. I just can't help but think about her. She never stood in a pulpit. She taught Bible classes when I was little. She was the one who sat on me when I wouldn't sit still. But if you think about powerful in the kingdom, she probably wouldn't be at the top of your list. But if you ever attended the Sanford Church of Christ, there was always a song leader standing up on the stage, but my Aunt Armilda was the song leader. Because her voice, and Rita knew my aunt for many years. Rita's knew my aunt since you were about, 8 years old. And she still says she remembers that voice towering. My aunt, when I decided to go to school to be a minister, she came to the front of the auditorium after I had preached a sermon. And she said something that I didn't like at the time. She said, "Now I want to ask you why you're doing this. Because if you're doing it because you want to be a preacher, then I am behind you 100%. But if you're doing it because you're tired of being a construction worker, then you need to think about something else." And I was offended at that moment. But you know how many times I've now repeated that same line to young men who are going into ministry? Because I've figured out that ministry isn't for the faint-hearted. And she needed to say that to me, and I needed to hear that. And as soon as I said, "Yes, ma'am, I really believe I'm doing it for the right reasons," once a month, while I was in school, I got a $25 check from my Aunt Armilda. Actually, it ended about middle of my junior year because I accepted a full-time preaching position in Mississippi while I was finishing up school. And I got a little note from her saying, "This is the last check I'll be sending you because you'll be working full-time, and I'm going to send this to someone else who's going to be going to school now." I wanted to call her and say, "Yeah, but this little church is only paying me $300 a week," but I didn't. I let her send it to someone else. And she did that. According to my cousin Lynn, she did that. She helped preachers go to school pretty much up until the last few years of her life. No, she never stood in a pulpit, and there wasn't anything fancy about my aunt. Just like there wasn't anything fancy about Simon the Tanner. But they both go to prove that God loves you and can use you no matter who you are. And then finally, I want to introduce you to Cornelius. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and his family were devout and God-fearing, he gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." God loves those who make us uncomfortable. Peter was not comfortable with Simon. Cornelius is a ruling centurion Gentile. Now, he's God-fearing. Many believe he may have been the centurion at the crucifixion. We don't know that. But his prayers to God are heard. His prayers to God are answered, and God uses Cornelius to spread the word. Now, we're going to talk more about Cornelius next week, but I want you to see how uncomfortable this would have been for Peter. This would have been uncomfortable. Peter was a Jew. This man was a Gentile. This was something that for Peter, he had to kind of broaden his comfort zone a little bit to be able to go and reach out. Matter of fact, in verse 14 of chapter 10 that we'll see next week, Peter's first reaction to God saying, "I want you to go," is, "Surely not, Lord." You've got to be wrong. This is not the person you want me to go to. You know, some people make us uncomfortable. So when we do that, we tend to avoid them, don't we? But instead of avoiding people who make us uncomfortable, we need to seek to understand those people. And we need to go to them. whether they be high maintenance or helpless or uncomfortable, we go. Now here's what I want us to see. What do all of these very different people have in common? Peter. That's what they have in common. He was called to minister to all of these people, and in some cases it was probably pretty easy. I'm sure he could relate with Simon. He was a fisherman, smelly trade. Actually had the same first name as Simon. So he had some things in common. But in other cases, it was difficult. Again, surely not, Lord. You can't be serious. You want me to go to who? You want me to go to Cornelius? But from this story, we learn that God loves all people. And he expects those who follow him to go to all people. There is no asterisk at the end of the Great Commission. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, asterisk, except those who make you feel uncomfortable. It's not there. We're called to go to all people. You see, God may call us to go to high maintenance people. People who drain our time and our energy and our resources. But guess what, church? We go anyway. And God may call us to go into what seems like helpless situations, broken marriages, broken homes, and broken hearts. But guess what? We help anyway. And God may call us to reach ordinary people, white-collar people, blue-collar people, no-collar people. But guess what? We reach anyway. And God may call us to risk and leave our comfort zones and deal with immoral people or intimidating people or influential people. But guess what? We risk anyway. And do you know why? Think about Peter for a minute. At one time in his life, he fell into one of these categories. And so do we. There was a time that Peter was very high maintenance. Lord, if it's you, let me come out there on the water and walk with you. Oh, there's waves. Oh, I'm going to drown. Oh, help me. High maintenance. There were times that Peter was helpless as he was with the rest of the disciples waking up Jesus saying, Master, save us, we perish. After Jesus has already said, we're going to the other side. Peter was pretty ordinary. He was a fisherman. And Peter had times in his life when he was pretty uncomfortable as he's warming himself by the fire, 3 times saying, I don't know the man. No, I don't know who he is. You see, the thing is, at one time or another in our lives, all of us have fit into at least one of these categories, if not more. So when God calls you to minister to someone in one of these categories, we go. I mean, can you think of some high maintenance or some helpless or some ordinary people who need Jesus? Can you think of someone you may need to leave your comfort zone to reach out to? Then go. That's what Jesus did when he hung on the cross. That's what the cross brings out of us. It compels us to obey and do what Christ asks us to do. You see, when I look around this morning, I see a lot of different people. I see lawyers. I see accountants. I see scientists, teachers, salespeople, mechanics, IT techs, students, fast food workers, construction workers. But all of us have one thing in common. God loves us. But there's another thing that we have in common. If you are a Christian, someone was your Peter. And some of you right now specifically are thinking of someone, right? This is yes, this is no. You're thinking of someone, right? Someone was your Peter. Someone reached you. Someone reached out to you and found you in your high-maintenance, helpless, ordinary, uncomfortable state and brought you to Jesus. I say that to say this. Now it's your turn. It is your turn to be Peter for someone else. And if you're not a Christian this morning, maybe God's using me to reach you. Maybe these words this morning have encouraged you that you are loved no matter what, and that God can save you no matter what. And if you need to come to him this morning, we invite you to do so. All together, we stand and sing.
Seek ye first the